Welcome back to Watchpost Partners Podcast. I want to start today by asking you a question. What if the thing that you've been asking God to restore isn't actually what He's trying to give back to you? And before you shut down or think, well, no, I know exactly what I've been praying for, just stick with me for a minute. Because I think that we all go through seasons where things change, especially in business. We naturally start looking backwards when things start changing. We start remembering how things used to feel. Maybe there was a season when you felt confident in what you were doing, you weren't questioning every decision, you weren't constantly wondering if you were making the right move. You had a rhythm. You knew your business, you knew your people, and you understood what worked and what didn't. And then somewhere along the way, something changed. Maybe you can pinpoint exactly that moment, or maybe you can't. Maybe there wasn't one huge disaster. Maybe you just woke up one day and realized that you were working harder than you used to, thinking about the business more than you used to, carrying more stress than you used to, but somehow feeling less clear than you have ever felt. And if you're anything like me, your first response is definitely to try to figure it out. Because that's what we do as business owners. We look at what's not working and we start moving things around. We start asking questions. Maybe we need the new strategy, a change in our marketing. Maybe we need to offer something different or hire someone. Maybe you hired the wrong person. Maybe the networking isn't enough, or maybe I'm actually networking too much. Maybe I need to post more on social media. Maybe I need to get off social media altogether. And before long, you've diagnosed your business with 15 different problems and created a list of 30 things that you need to fix. But underneath all of that, there's usually a quieter thought. And maybe you've never really said it out loud. You know the thought, I just want things to feel like they used to. I think that's a prayer that a lot of us pray without actually saying the words. God, can you just get me back there? Back when I was excited or when I felt confident, back to when business all made sense, back to when I felt like I knew what I was doing. And we call this restoration. God, restore my business, restore what I've lost. God, restore the opportunities. God, restore the momentum. And there's nothing wrong with asking God for restoration. Scripture talks about restoration, and here's the question I've been wrestling with. What if I misunderstood what restoration is actually supposed to look like? What if I've been asking God to restore something, but I've already decided the finished product and what it's going to look like? Basically, I'm saying, God, restore this. But what I really mean is, God, put it back to exactly the way that it was. And what if God isn't trying to make me go backwards? What if the next harvest doesn't look anything like the one that I remember? Would I still recognize it as restoration? And that's what I really want to talk to you about today. Because I was reading in Acts 15 and I got to verse 16 and 17 and it said, after this, I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild and I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name. There's two words that really stood out to me. I will. God says, I will return. I will rebuild. I will restore. And as I was reading that, I started thinking about another verse that we hear quoted all the time from Joel 2:25. I will restore to you the years of the swarming locust have eaten. And I started thinking about that, restore. Because I think sometimes when you hear, and I hear a word like restoration, we already have a picture in our head of what we think it means. We think restoration means getting something back. We think it means things going back to the way they were. If you've ever restored an old house, and I have, you usually try to make it look the way it did before. If you restore an old car, you're trying to bring it back to its original condition. So naturally, when we read that God is going to restore something, I think a lot of us assume that that means God is going to give us the old version back. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I know that I have. You start praying for God to restore something, but if we're really honest with ourselves, what we're really asking Him to do is to take us backwards. God, can you just make it feel the way it used to? Can you make my business work the way it used to? Can I get back to that season when I felt like I knew what I was doing? Because there are seasons in business where things just seem to work. You know what I mean? You have a rhythm, you understand your business, you know where your customers are coming from, you know what you need to do every day. And even if it's busy, there's certain comfort in knowing the formula. You do this, and usually this happens. You put this much effort in, and usually you'll see this result. But then there are other seasons where that formula just doesn't seem to work anymore, and it's so frustrating, especially when you've been in business for a while, because you're sitting there thinking, I've already done this before. I know how to run a business. I know how to market. I know how to sell, and I definitely know how to lead people. So you start doing more of the things that used to work. And when it doesn't, you do even more. Maybe you even change the strategy, maybe the pricing, maybe you launch something new or hire someone. Maybe you listen to 5 podcasts and buy a course from somebody on Instagram who promises to completely change your business in 30 days. And I'm not saying the strategy portion is bad. Obviously, I own a marketing agency. I firmly believe in strategy. I believe at looking at numbers, and I believe in making smart decisions. But I've also learned something over the year. Sometimes we are trying to solve a spiritual season with a business strategy. I'm going to say it again. Sometimes we are all trying to solve a spiritual season with a business strategy. And that's hard for business owners to hear because we are fixers. If you're an entrepreneur, you probably have something in you that sees a problem and immediately starts thinking about how to fix it. That's probably part of the reason that you're in business in the first place. You saw a need, you saw an opportunity, and you thought, I could do this better. So when something isn't working in our own business, our instinct is to get our hands on it. We want to fix it, rebuild it. We want to get it working again. But when I read Acts 15, God doesn't say, give me the plans for David's tent and I'll help you put it all together. No, he says, I will rebuild. And I don't know why, but it really stopped me today because I started thinking about how many times I've asked God to bless something that I was already rebuilding without ever asking him if that's what he wanted me to rebuild. Have you ever done that? Have you ever already made the decision and then asked God to bless it? Because I have done that so many times. I've basically gone to God with my entire business plan finished and said, okay, God, here's what we're doing. I just need you to sign off on this. And then when it doesn't work, we get frustrated. God, where are you? Why aren't you helping me? Why does this feel so hard? And maybe God isn't absent. Maybe he's just not building what I'm building. That's a hard question, but I think it's an important one. What if the reason that you can't get something back to the way it used to is because God isn't trying to take you back? I want you to think about that because I think sometimes we romanticize previous seasons. We remember when business felt easier. We remember when the money was better. We remember when we were really excited to go to work. We remember having this big vision that we couldn't stop talking about. And then life happens, business happens, leadership happens. And a few years later, you're sitting in your office thinking, how did I get here? Maybe you don't hate your business. Maybe you don't even want to quit. You just know something feels different. That's probably the best way I can explain what happened to me. There was a season in my business where I couldn't necessarily point to one thing and say this was the problem. I just knew it was changing. And my response was to try to figure it out. I kept thinking there had to be a business answer. Maybe we needed to change the services, market different. Maybe we need to network harder, work harder. And I spent a lot of time trying to diagnose the business. But looking back, I think God was doing something much deeper in me. And that's why I keep talking about this idea that sometimes you don't have a business problem. Sometimes God is truly dealing with the heart of the business owner. He's dealing with our identity. He's dealing with our need for control. He's dealing with where we find our security and how we define the word success. And sometimes, if we're being honest, we've attached so much of who we are to what we've built that we don't know who we are when it starts changing. I love that. I love thinking about that because that was true of me. That who we are and what we have built is our identity. And when things start changing, we actually don't know who we are anymore. I think that's why restoration can be confusing. Because we read in Joel 2:25, I will restore to you the years that the locust swarming has eaten. And we immediately start thinking about what we want back. But go back and read the verse before that. Joel 2:12 says, even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all of your heart. Return to me. He's such a gentle, gentle Father who woos us back to him, right? He loves us. He's not harsh. He's not criticizing us. He wants our heart. And that's where the restoration conversation starts. Not return to your old business model or return to the version of yourself that was making more money or return to the season when everything felt easy. God says, hey, return to me. And I think some of us are asking God to restore things while he's asking us to simply return. There's a difference. And I want to be careful because I don't think every difficult season means that you've done something wrong. I don't think if your business is struggling, it automatically means you haven't been faithful. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I do think difficult seasons have a way of revealing where our heart goes first. When things get uncomfortable, where do you go? Do you go straight to strategy or panic? Do you start calling everybody you know, asking what you should do? Do you spend 3 hours watching YouTube videos trying to figure out the next business trend? Or do you return to God? I'm asking myself this question too, because my natural response is usually to just figure it out. I like answers, I like plans, I like knowing what's next, and I love control in my business. I don't particularly enjoy waiting, which is probably why Habakkuk 2 has become such an important passage for me. Habakkuk says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me. He goes to the watchpost. And here's what's interesting. Habakkuk had questions. He was confused. He didn't understand what God was doing. And God doesn't shame him for asking. But Habakkuk positions himself to listen. And I think that's the part that we skip over. We want the Habakkuk 2:2 where it says, write down the vision and make it plain, right? We love the vision portion. Business owners love vision. Give me the vision, give me the plan, give me the 5 steps, tell me what we're building. But one verse before verse 2 is where we need to land. Before Habakkuk writes the vision, he goes to the watchpost. He waits to hear. And I wonder how many of us are actually writing down visions God never gave us because we didn't stay at the watchpost long enough to hear him. That's something I have been wrestling with personally. Because I can build something, and you probably can too. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you're a leader or a business owner. You know how to make things happen. You know how to take an idea and turn it into something. And that's a gift. God gave us those gifts. But just because I can build something doesn't mean God asked me to build it. And just because I can rebuild something doesn't mean God is restoring it. Sometimes I think that we're standing in the ruins trying to put every brick back together exactly where it was. And God is saying, would you stop for a minute and ask me what I'm building? That's what I see in Habakkuk 2, right next to Acts 15. Habakkuk teaches me to get into position to hear. And Acts reminded me today that God is the one who rebuilds it. And in Joel, that reminds me that God can restore what devastating season has consumed. And here's the thing I really want you to hear today. The next harvest may not look like the one that you lost. Think about the locust and Joel. Those people lived off the land. Their crops mattered. Their harvest mattered. When locusts came through and destroyed everything, it wasn't a minor setback. Their entire livelihood was affected. Their future was affected. And God said, I will restore the years the locust has eaten. But how do you restore a year? You can't go backward. You can't go back and relive the last year. You can't recreate every opportunity. You can't undo every decision, right? You can't force everything back into the exact same position it was before. So when God talks about restoring the years, I don't think he's promising a time machine. He's saying the barren season does not get the final word. The locust may have eaten the harvest, but the locust did not destroy God's ability to produce another harvest. And maybe somebody listening to this needs to hear that. Because you've been so focused on what's been consumed, you haven't considered what God might grow next. You're looking back. You're comparing everything to what it used to be. You're saying, my business I used to have, we used to be able to, and I understand that. I really do. But what if the next thing that God is growing doesn't look anything like the last one? Would you recognize it as restoration? That's the question I keep asking myself. Would I recognize God's restoration if it didn't look like what I asked him to give me back? Because if I'm only looking for the old harvest, I might completely miss the new one. And this is where Acts 15:17 really got me. God says he will rebuild David's fallen tent. And then he tells us why. That the rest of mankind might seek the Lord. The rebuilding always has purpose. It wasn't just about making something look good again. It wasn't about just fixing the ruins. There were people connected to the rebuilding. And I started thinking about business differently when I read that. What if God is doing something in your business that isn't only about your business? I know it's hard to think about because when you're the one paying the bills and the one responsible for payroll, when you're the one lying awake at night thinking about decisions, of course it feels personal. But what if there are people connected to your obedience that you haven't even met yet? What if there's an employee that you're going to lead differently because of what God is teaching you right now? What if there's another business owner who's going to hear your story 3 years from now and realize that they're not alone? What if there's somebody who will seek God because they watched you walk through a season where you didn't have all the answers? Think about that. What if there's somebody who will seek God because they watched you walk through a season where you didn't have all the answers? That's what Acts 15 says. I will rebuild. I will restore. And then that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord. God's restoration had reach. It affected people beyond the ruins. And maybe that's why rebuilding looks different. Maybe God isn't trying to give you your old business back because the old version of your business couldn't carry where he's taking you. Maybe the old version of you couldn't lead the people that he's about to put right in front of you. Maybe you need to learn something. Maybe you need to surrender something. Maybe you need to stop finding your identity in your revenue. I think that's a big one for business owners. Maybe we needed to learn that you can be obedient when you don't understand the outcome. I don't know what that is for you, and I don't want to sit here and pretend I have a neat answer for every difficult season because I don't. I'm still walking this out in my own life. But I can tell you that I've spent enough time trying to rebuild things on my own with my own hands, and I know how exhausting it was. There's a difference between working hard in obedience and striving out of fear. They look similar from the outside. Both people are working, both people are making decisions, both people are showing up, but internally, in that leader, they look very different. Obedience says, God, Show me what you're building, and I'll put my hands to it. Striving says, God, I'm going to keep building until you finally bless it. I've done both. And striving will wear you out because every result becomes personal. Every client that says no really feels personal. Every bad month feels personal. Every plan that doesn't feel like evidence is that you're failing. But when you start understanding that God may be rebuilding something different, you can finally ask a different question. Instead of asking, how do I get back to where I was? Why don't we ask, God, what are you growing right now? Instead of saying, how do I make this work again? I want to encourage you to ask God, is this still what you want me putting my hands to? Instead of asking, why did you let me lose that season? Ask, what did you teach me there that I'm supposed to carry to the next harvest? Those are uncomfortable questions because God may not give you the answer you expected. And that's the Watchpost. That's why I named this company Watchpost Partners. The Watchpost isn't a place where you go because you already have the answer. You go there because you don't. You position yourself, you look, you listen, you wait. And when God gives the vision, then you move. Maybe today you feel like you're standing in the middle of something that doesn't look the way it used to, and you've been trying really hard to restore it. Can I ask you something? What are you actually asking God to restore? Have you thought about that? When you pray, God, restore my business, what does that mean in your mind? Does it mean a certain revenue number, feeling successful again, being recognized, finally feeling secure? Does it mean getting back to the version of yourself that felt confident? There's nothing wrong with being honest about it. But I think we need to know what picture of restoration we're holding on to. Because maybe God is restoring you. Maybe he's building the leader before he rebuilds the business. Maybe he's restoring your peace or your ability to hear him. Maybe he's restoring your relationship with your family after years of your business getting the best parts of you. Maybe he's restoring your understanding of why you started this in the first place. And maybe eventually the numbers change too. Maybe the business grows, opportunities come. Maybe there is financial restoration. I hope so. But I don't want to miss what God is doing in me because I'm staring at a number, waiting for proof that he is restoring something. The locust ate the harvest, but it couldn't touch God's ability to bring rain. It couldn't touch God's ability to produce seed. And it couldn't touch God's ability to create another season. And it certainly couldn't cancel God's purpose. So maybe the question isn't, will I ever get back what I lost? Maybe the question is, will I trust God enough to let him decide what restoration looks like for me and my business? Because Acts 15 says, I will rebuild. Joel says, I will restore. And Habakkuk says, I will stand at my watch and I will see what he will say to me. God rebuilds, he restores, and I need to position myself to hear and then obey. Maybe you've been trying to do God's part. Maybe you've been carrying the weight of rebuilding something that only God can restore. But I want to encourage you this week to get quiet and ask him, God, am I trying to rebuild something you need me to release? Am I looking for an old harvest when you're planting something brand new? What are you restoring in me right now? And maybe the hardest question is, would I recognize your restoration if it looked different than what I've lost? Sit with it. Don't rush to answer it. Go to the Watchpost and listen. Because the harvest may not look like the one that you lost, but it doesn't mean God isn't restoring. It may mean he's growing something with a greater purpose that you can't see right now. And maybe, just like Acts 15, there are people on the other side of the rebuilding who will seek God because of what he chose to restore through you. Today in my Bible study, I asked the ladies, can you pray that I can get myself quiet to hear what the next steps are for my business? And I think that's the hardest thing for business owners, is to find quiet in our minds, in our schedules, in our days. But pray for a stillness. If this episode connected with you, send it to another business owner, not because they need another business strategy. Maybe they just need permission to stop trying to force an old season to work again. And if you're a business owner or leader who wants to have these conversations with other people who understand what it's like to carry the weight of leadership, I want you to invite you to connect with Watchpost Partners. I'll see you next time.